talking about today, because it's our first temple that we're seeing together. What I like to do usually on the tours is on each temple we'll talk about a different aspect of the temple. Sometimes about its religious background, sometimes the construction, sometimes the rituals practiced in it, and so on. Because this is our first temple, we just want to talk today about the layout of the temple and the meaning of the temple to the ancient Egyptians. What does the temple mean? When I say the word temple, what comes to your mind? What's a temple?
Religious.
It's a place of worship. Thank you. We all agree on that? That's the first point, right? Now erase that part of the memory, because the temple in ancient Egypt is not a place of worship. Right? Remember what I said before? Put yourself in the position of the Egyptians. Forget modern thinking. Try to think the way they thought of things. It will make it a lot easier to understand and a lot easier to comprehend the concept behind it. The word for temple in ancient Egyptian is the house of the god. It is actually the residence place of the gods. This is where the gods live. It's not a place of worship. The place of worship should be open to everybody who believes in this god to come in and worship. Temples of Egypt were not. Commoners were never allowed into the inner parts of the temple. They were only allowed into the outer, open courts or sections of the temple. Depending on where you rank in society, how far into the temple you can go. To have a proper and complete temple in ancient Egypt, you need 5 things. There are 5 things that make up a complete temple. The first and the most important, the first part that they start building in any temple, is the shrine. You have to have a shrine, a sanctuary, holy of the holies, as they called it. It's usually the innermost part of the temple. A smaller room, it's not huge, completely roofed, hardly any windows, if any, it's very tiny little slits near the top of the walls, just to admit just about enough light for the priest to see what's in there when they go in to do the rituals. And of course it has its own door, which is usually sealed, opened only by the priest when they go in and out for the rituals, and completely open during the annual services. In the center of that shrine is placed a stone pedestal, quite often of granite. Okay? And on top of that granite pedestal is placed the sacred boat, or the sacred part of the gods, made out of wood, which has a little shrine or chapel on it. And inside that chapel or shrine is where the statue of the god is placed. And the god or the goddess, depending on who the temple belongs to, lives inside that statue. That's where the gods live. Surrounding and just outside this shrine, second part of the temple, is a large number of storage rooms in which offerings were stored. Offerings presented by the population, by the kings, incense burners, incense itself, perfumes, oils, jewelry, costumes, all sorts of different things that the people presented to the temples were kept inside these storage rooms to be used by the priests of the temple during the daily rituals or the annual celebrations. Okay? It's the second. The third part of the temple is what we call the hypostyle hall. A big, spacious, colonnaded and roofed room in which annual celebrations were conducted. During these annual celebrations, the boat of the god will be carried from the shrine out to this hall, and the services are attended by members of the royal family, the elite, high officials, and so on. You can.
Yeah, I wanted to get out of the sun, but it smells like urine everywhere. Just to be perfectly honest.
Right? So that's the third part of the temple, the colonnaded halls for the annual festival. Outside these colonnaded halls, you have a big open court. That's where the commoners were allowed to come and attend these festivals. They were never allowed into the inside, only to the open courts. And then finally, every temple, like any other building, has to have a doorway, has to have something to mark the beginning of the sacred site of the temple. And it's either a small stone doorway or a big, huge pylon like the one we see in the distance up there. We call these pylons, these facades that form the entrance into the temple proper, they're called the pylons. And that marks the beginning of the sacred section of the temple. Okay? So these are the 5 elements of every temple we will see from now on.
Okay, is the temple always dedicated to one god?
Not necessarily. There is always a major god of the temple, but like in this case, for example, it's dedicated to the goddess Isis. But there are 2 side shrines as well next to the major shrine, one for her husband and one for her son. Usually in the temples you have a major god and maybe his family, his wife and son. So. But there are some exceptions. We'll see one of the exceptions actually when we visit Komombo. There are exceptions to this rule. Shall we go through the 5 parts again of the temple quickly?
Yeah.
You have the shrine, the sanctuary, and the Holy of the Holies on the inside. Storage rooms around it for storing offerings to be used in the rituals. The hypostyle or the colonnaded halls for the annual celebrations attended by the elite and the kings. The open courts, like the one just up here for the commoners, and then the doorway. Okay. 2 other things were added to the building on the outside out of necessity more than anything else. Every temple in ancient Egypt had to have a source of water, a sacred source of water. The water from that source is taken to be used for the purification that everybody has to do before they enter into the temple, even the king. Also for the making of the incense and perfumes and oils which are used as offerings for the temple. And that's a very important point here. That's where the temples actually had most of the resources coming from. These offerings. You cannot buy offerings off the street in the bazaar and come and present it to the temple of Osiris or Ammon or Mut or any of them. To present offerings to a god, you have to buy from the temple of the god. So the priests had the control of the sale of these offerings. Okay, that's why, if you remember, as I said, the incense trade was very important. It was brought in because that's one of the major things that were presented as offerings.
So you bought it from the priest.
You bought it from the priest in the
Then you
temple.
made the offering of it, and then he collected it and then sold it again.
Exactly. Exactly. Because remember, the commoners are not allowed into the temple anyway. You cannot go inside the temple to buy it. So you stand at the door of the temple and find a nice priest and pay him a little bit of money to buy whatever offering you want and a little bit extra to make sure he will get it back to you. He goes into the temple, picks it up from the storage, comes back to you at the door and give it to you. Now you have to put it inside the shrines. You're not allowed into the temple. So you find another nice priest, give him the offerings and give him a little bit of extra to make sure that he put it in the right place. Halfway back in the journey, he meets another friend and they start talking and chatting and have a couple of cigarettes and a drink of coffee. By the time he's finished, he's got this offering in his hand and doesn't know what it was for. Where does the offering go? In the offering room. So he goes back and puts it in storage.
These are
And it's sold to the next person in line.
these are Madoff's relatives.
Recycling of offerings. Okay? So that is the 5 things. That was one of the things, as we said, is the source of water for the temple. The second one, which is very important, a mud brick surrounding wall. Surrounding wall of mud brick that surrounds the entire complex. The temple proper, the sacred lake, the living quarters of the priests, all of that is enclosed inside the mud brick wall. What's the purpose of that mud brick wall? Shelter from rain. It's just a mud brick wall. Rain will fall on either side. It's not roofed. It's just a wall. No. No. Enemies would have made more sense to build it out of stone. But it has to be of mud brick. Stone doesn't work for the purpose. Floods. To protect the temples from the floods. A stone wall in ancient Egypt, remember the ancient Egyptians never used mortar? A stone wall without mortar will not hold water. The water will come through it. A mud brick wall will. So these walls were built out of mud bricks surrounding the whole temple to protect it from the annual flood. Every year, after every flood, they go back and reconstruct and restore this wall to prepare it for the next year. Okay? You will see in some of the temples we'll visit, you will see sections of these walls still remaining. Some of them were thick enough that during the early Arab period or the early Islamic period, people were living on top of the walls. You had villages built on top of the walls. That's how thick these walls were. And some were very, very high. You mentioned something very interesting, to make the hill. Okay? When these walls were built, they were never built parallel to the ground. They were never built in a straight line. They were always